Director of an organization with an office in Manhattan called the Endangered Language Alliance, which I'll talk a little bit about. I also just wrote a book which just came out called Language City, which I'll talk a little bit about, the fight to preserve endangered mother tongues in New York. And yeah, I think we can keep this super casual. I guess I'll talk for a while, but if anybody has like a pressing question or doesn't understand something or whatever, raise your hand, we'll chat about it. We'll also have time at the end for Q&A. I want to thank these guys so much. Tom Minori, an old friend, LaGuardia, amazing place. I think I'm just guessing the number of languages in this building right now is extraordinary, and in this room, we are sitting in the middle of the most linguistically diverse part of the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. So that's what I want to talk about. That's been the focus of my research. What does that mean? I'm not an oral historian, truly, so apologies to the oral historians in the room, but I think that hopefully the work that we do as linguists has something to say to oral history, and it's all about, some similar techniques and ideas, because most of the languages we're talking about, most of the languages in the world are primarily oral languages. They have not historically been read or written. Reading and writing come very late in the game of human language, of human history. Really just, at most in the last sort of 5,000-6,000 years, you start to have writing systems, but human language goes back, we don't know, at least 100,000 years or something like that. So writing really develops in a certain small number of societies, really ones that have states, right, and that have governments and that start to have certain kinds of economies, and then it gets into religious systems and so on, but it's really only just for a few languages and in a few places that you see writing. So most of human language, most of the 7,000 plus human languages in the world are primarily oral. So oral history is fundamental. If you want to understand the languages of the world, if you want to understand the experiences of speakers of most of the languages in the world, you need to sort of focus on the oral. Writing is a truly secondary thing from the linguistic point of view. So with that said, let's see if this is working. Everything I say is going to kind of come out of this book, which I understand maybe some people saw a chapter of or read a chapter of, but it just came out, hot off the press, Language City. So that if you want the expanded version of this, that's where it's at. And I'm doing various events, even one tonight at the New York Public Library that's kind of, about the book and sort of unpacks basically this past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city. How did this come to be? But I guess we have to start by talking about global linguistic diversity, right? If New York is some kind of representation of this whole global picture, what is the global picture, right? So as I said, I don't know if this is clear to read, but I'll try to summarize it. We're talking about over 7,000 languages spoken around the world today, as well as signed. So there are actually up to something like 200 sign languages as well, not just ASL, but sign languages are just as various. And they come from hundreds of different language families. So a language family, this is something that historical linguistics is all about, is basically where languages share a sort of common ancestor language. So, a famous example are the Indo-European languages, which stretch across a lot of Europe and Asia, and that includes everything from English to Hindi, as well as Russian, and hundreds of other languages that you may know, have heard of less. But basically, a language family has, its whole own history that could stretch back thousands of years. And, there are many cases actually of language isolates as well, where a family is just represented by a single language, which could mean that the other, cousin or brother or sister languages have disappeared. Or it could mean we just don't know enough to connect it to other languages. But basically, when we say that there are hundreds of families, part of what that should make you consider is that languages are deeply different, right? If they're coming from different families, that means that they have histories that kind of diverged, in some cases, thousands of years ago. So when we say 7,000 plus languages, we're not just talking about sort of small differences between languages. We're talking about things that go pretty deep into the grammar and the lexicon, which is, the vocabulary. And we're not even getting into this question of what's a language versus a dialect. This is an age-old question. We can talk about it if you like. But if we were to talk about dialects, we'd really be talking about, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Nobody really can enumerate. the linguistic idea of a language versus a dialect, just briefly, centers on this idea of mutual intelligibility. So if two people speaking to each other in their sort of normal native way at normal rate of speech and so on, or signing, if they can basically understand each other, then we can say that they're speaking two dialects of the same language. If they basically can't understand each other, then we'll say it's two separate languages. Now, in practice, mutual intelligibility is kind of a difficult thing to test, right? And a lot of things go into that. What are they talking about? How well do they know each other? You know, how much are they adjusting to each other, and so on. But basically, mutual intelligibility is what linguists try to use. That looks a little bit different than how people use these terms in sort of non-specialist kind of everyday speech, like, oh, I just speak a dialect, or oh, that's just a dialect. That often gets bound up with politics, because often oral languages are sort of dismissed as dialects, or less powerful languages are kind of called dialects. There are, I mean, notice these words, language and dialect, are in English, right? This talk, I'm giving this in English. There are related words, but, you know, historically, language comes out of Latin, dialect comes out of Greek. Sometime in the Renaissance in Europe, these two terms kind of got entangled, and at least in European languages, there came to be this idea of language versus dialect. But even sometimes, you know, in Mexico, when people say dialecto versus dialect in the US, often different things are meant. And sometimes, as a way of sort of dismissing indigenous languages of Mexico, for instance, it'll just be like, oh, that's just dialecto. But that doesn't really fit what I said the linguistic definition is around mutual intelligibility. And in different languages, they don't talk about language and dialect, right? In Chinese, they'll be talking about yuyan and fangyan, which are different terms with different histories. Also tuhua, which means like a local type of speech. This is just the example of Mandarin. So, you know, there's a lot we could unpack in terms of language and dialect. A sort of pithy maxim that linguists have sort of started to use is to express the power relations that are part of this is a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. This was originally said in Yiddish, actually, by a teacher from the Bronx who was a Yiddish speaker. And what they were saying basically is it has to do with political power, right? Who's able to sort of uplift their way of speaking, standardize it, and call it a language. Right, that means that it has gotten sort of a government behind it, it has media, it has an education system, and therefore it sort of proclaims itself a language, and then often relegates the other things to dialect, or sometimes we would say accent, right? Oh, they speak with an accent. Everybody speaks with an accent, really. But anyway, so, you know, we're talking here about 7,000 plus languages, not to mention all the sort of local varieties and dialects. We're talking about them being deeply, deeply different historically. And, you know, we're talking about them having very different kinds of features, too. It's not just about the, you know, sort of hanging different labels on the same world, but actually some deep differences in how the world is kind of perceived and divided that exist between languages. And as I said, the vast majority are traditionally oral. They don't have any kind of government support. They haven't been standardized in ways that the sort of national and powerful languages have been standardized that we might take for granted. The whole idea that you can pick up a dictionary of English, let's say, and see that this is the way this is supposed to be spelled, this is exactly how this is supposed to be said, or whatever. That kind of standardization process has not happened for most of the world's languages. And most people historically have been multilingual. So monolingualism, which, you know, we might think of in the US now, there are a lot of English language monolinguals. That's pretty rare historically. And indeed in New York, as we'll talk about, half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. So New York is fundamentally multilingual. Most people you see on the street have some knowledge of 2 or more languages, in some cases 5, 6, 7 languages. And that is historically normal in most of the world. All of that said, what we're going to sort of get into today is that as many as half of the world's languages are now considered endangered by linguists. And, you know, we'll talk about what that means, but languages have always come and gone, but this particular historical situation where as many as half of the world's languages are endangered is historically unprecedented. And it has a lot of parallels to what's going on with plant and animal species. Biodiversity is similarly endangered. Biodiversity is similarly kind of concentrated in certain hotspots, certain parts of the world, which, for reasons we can discuss, have maintained that sort of deeper levels of diversity. You know, and obviously we're talking about cultural diversity as well. These things are all kind of bound up in each other, but there are so-called kind of language hotspots in the world that often, you know, are defined by their topography, places that are, have mountains or islands. There's been a certain degree of isolation. It's not about total isolation. Like I said, there's multilingualism, and there's always been kind of mixing and contact. But those are the places that have been away from the empires and nation states and markets and things that have been sort of pressuring people towards a small number of languages. But part of what I want to get into today is how actually New York City and other cities are now a new kind of linguistic hotspot, right? And what we as linguists are trying to do in terms of documenting and mapping that. So it might be a little hard to see, but you can see a kind of world of dots showing where where endangered languages are spoken to the best of our kind of ability to map. Of course, you can't sort of pin a language to a map in this way, but you can see that it's not evenly distributed across the world, right? Obviously, there's different population densities in different places as well. Many have noticed that there's a general tendency for languages to be clustered around the equator, which is interesting. That's something true with biodiversity as well. But this also has to do with where empires and nations and political pressures have been. So you see certain parts of the world, whether it's the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., the Amazon rainforest, West and Central Africa, the Himalaya, which is an area where I've done a lot of work. Papua New Guinea, famously, is a place of incredible linguistic diversity. There are these hotspots. What do we mean by endangerment? What are we talking about? There are a lot of different ways to define it and think about it. Partly, it's about speaker numbers, like you might think. There are many languages in the world which really are thought to have one or a few speakers. You might say, well, what does that mean when there's one speaker of a language? Who do they have to speak to? What does that look like? That's a good question. I mean, at that point, it's already kind of at a point of perhaps no return in a sense. But speaker numbers are part of the story, and about half of the world's languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers. But many have historically been pretty small as well, and actually somewhat stable in some cases, in certain situations. With even 100 or 200 speakers, some languages have been able to be stable over time in the right kind of, sort of multilingual ecology or equilibrium. But the bigger factor than numbers is intergenerational transmission, whether it's getting passed on to the next generation, right? And that's happening primarily in the home, from parents, grandparents, caretakers, caregivers, more so than, schools or, books or education systems. The home has been historically, and I think is the fundamental place where language is transmitted. And even a single kind of massive break in transmission happening in the home in one generation can really alter the fate of a language. It's very hard to sort of pick it up again if, for one generation, a group of parents, grandparents, whatever, have decided that they don't want to pass this on for whatever reason, in many cases under pretty heavy pressures. So linguists have different ways of kind of measuring this. This is just to show probably the most commonly used scale, which is has a sort of 0 through 10, all the way from kind of an international language, like in English or Mandarin or Spanish, to languages that, sometimes people use the word extinct. Sometimes it's better to use a word like sleeping or dormant, because people will try to revive them, as we can talk about. The fundamental issue is that you have the world's sort of 7,000 plus languages. I think at this stage, the fundamental issue is trying to fit into about 200 nation states. So this is the political map of the world, and these are, sort of modern borders that are being drawn. And of course, they can be redrawn, and they're being, challenged in different ways. But basically, you have a world with so many fewer nation states than languages, and these are much more recent forms than the languages, which in most cases have been developing, as I said, out of processes that have been going back thousands of years in many cases. Also kind of hard to see, but basically this is showing how there are now these largest languages in the world. Of course, English, very prominent among them, but obviously other just, large languages which are now kind of spreading through nation states and other factors. So I guess, I'm going to just move really quickly through some of this stuff just to give you guys a sense of the terrain, and then we can kind of go back into whatever is most interesting. But there's a new kind of set of discussions around language justice. What would that look like? How does that relate to environmental justice, economic justice, social justice, racial justice? It's, language cannot be sort of pulled apart from all these other processes which are happening in the world, right? Political, socioeconomic processes. There's basically very little thus far in terms of language rights. A lot of people say, well, what about the UN? Or what about, there's a little bit of discussion there, but fundamentally, this is something kind of in its infancy. And there are still a lot of questions that people differ on and that need to be kind of discussed, right? Like, are we talking about a utilitarian point of view where, what matters is what are the most widely spoken languages? Are they covered? Do people have interpretation and translation in them? Should we care about these much smaller languages? Are they important? I can say from a linguistic point of view, certainly the linguistic logic is that every language is equally complex when spoken natively, and in terms of its grammar and in terms of its, sort of structures. No language is somehow more developed or superior to any other. That really doesn't make sense from a linguistic point of view. Every language has evolved to do the things that its speakers have needed to do. And if you need to borrow a word like iPhone or internet, you borrow it, and then that's it. It's not that a language is so modern for having, a word for something in technology. Words can be borrowed very easily. But in terms of grammar and structure, there's this idea of kind of linguistic equality, basically, which linguists can clearly affirm. And in fact, we learn much more often from smaller languages, which have, in some cases, much sort of more sophisticated and interesting and complex structures than widely spoken languages, which sometimes get kind of leveled off in a way. Regardless of that, so that would be a kind of idea of valuing all languages on their own terms. But there's all kinds of forms of linguistic discrimination that go on. It's not just these ambient pressures that are working on languages, but also in some cases outright bans where you're not allowed to speak a language, you're not allowed to get education in your mother tongue. And we could talk about all the benefits of linguistic diversity as well. Certainly some will always say, it's always a question, well, wouldn't life be easier? Wouldn't it all be peaceful if we all spoke the same language? I think there's a lot of civil wars and other things that show that is not the case. Plenty of problems can happen between people speaking the same language, right? Or, thinking they're speaking the same language. And actually places like Queens, I argue in the book, demonstrate that even when you have a multitude of languages, people can find a way to get along and to live together, right? And that something like English can function as a lingua franca, which is a language spoken as a sort of second language by a lot of people as a way to communicate among different groups without it being a sort of imposed official language, right? And there is no official language in the United States. There's no official language in New York City. Obviously, English functions in this crucial way for a lot of things to get done. Obviously, in a lot of ways, Spanish, by far being the second most widely spoken language, also is kind of crucial in that way. But then in a whole bunch of neighborhoods around the city, there are also kind of more lingua francas that function in those areas, right? If you're in Brighton Beach, Russian is the key language. If you're in the middle of Jackson Heights, it's going to be a South Asian language like Hindi or Urdu or Bengali. So there's room for multiple lingua francas as well. I want to just give like a whirlwind linguistic history of the city, which is again more in depth in the book, and then we'll sort of get maybe more into the oral history pieces of it in a sense. But the original language of this place is Lenape, of not just New York City but this whole extended area. And Lenape is at this point also an example of a highly endangered language with essentially one speaker left who's in Canada, and who I meet briefly in the book. But as well, there's a growing group of revivalists as part of this kind of newer practice of language revitalization, and because there are still thousands of Lenape people in various pockets in Canada, in Oklahoma, and in the surrounding area here, pushed out to those places through the colonial processes that shaped where we are. What I write about in the book is how the language is now being sort of brought back. And being brought back to New York City. And this was at our center on 18th Street, really the first time that the language has been taught in the city as far as we know for the last 3+ centuries by this woman, Karen Moscow, who I profile in the book. What's that? It's called the Endangered Language Alliance. It's where I'm co-director. So I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second. these are just some of the processes of that shaped the Lenape diaspora. Where the language was not being spoken on a daily basis here in the city since really the 18th century, but managed in an extraordinary way to survive all of these different migrations and expulsions. But now is in the position of an endangered language, much like most Native American languages and so many languages around the world. So then you have exactly 400 years ago the founding of New Amsterdam, right, the sort of colonial founding of this place by the Dutch West India Company. And even then, the sort of unique template of a multilingual city was being set, I would say. So unlike the other sort of 12 colonies of the 13 colonies, which were basically English-speaking or English only even, this place was founded, you could say, by Dutch speakers, and it was also by a company as a sort of multilingual commercial port that actually was not like initially an official part of the Netherlands, but was actually this place where all these company employees were kind of coming. And in the very earliest decades, according to one report, there were as many as 18 languages spoken by the first sort of 400 people who were here. Which seems to have included Lenape speakers and other Native Americans who were still here. It seems to have included enslaved Africans who were brought here in the very initial stages as well and spoke a number of languages from what's today Angola and the Congo. And it seems to have included a variety of different European languages as well, principally brought by various religious refugees who were coming and were also sort of seeking a new place to live. So the 400-year anniversary right now is marking the arrival of speakers of Walloon, which is a minority language of the Belgian-French border, and those were the religious refugees who were initially coming here. So it wasn't just people speaking Dutch. It was actually this whole kind of mix. Dutch functioned as a lingua franca, but this multilingualism was sort of set deep into the city at that time. We don't know exactly what those 18 languages were. I've tried to reconstruct and actually kind of, I think, found more than 18 probably that were spoken, but this is just to show sort of the Native American languages, the African languages, the European languages. This was a city that formed at the intersection of 3 continents, basically, right? Europe, Africa, and North America, the Americas. And, since then, basically the book traces the deepening of this multilingualism through the city's history and argues that the defining aspect of this city has been the constant waves of immigration and the presence of many languages and peoples kind of coming together and mixing and shaping each other in different ways. And it's shaped the city on so many different levels. So even when the English take over from the Dutch, right, after a war in 1664, the English take over, even after the U.S. declares its independence, and so it's part of another country. This place, as it becomes New York, and the New York we know today, is kind of deepening with all these layers of immigration and different layers of language. And that actually, in fact, linguistic minorities and speakers of oral languages are overrepresented here compared to what you might think, and compared to the ratios in the home countries, right? So in a lot of cases, we might think, oh, well, then a lot of Italian immigrants came, then a lot of Mexican immigrants came, and a lot of Russian immigrants came. But actually, the deeper story is to say that, well, actually the vast majority of those Italian immigrants were from Sicily and southern Italy and spoke a variety of languages very different from standard Italian, varieties of Sicilian and Neapolitan and so on. That those Mexican immigrants actually came from Puebla and Guerrero and southern Mexico, and that they were heavily representing indigenous languages, more so than in Mexico as a whole, and so on. So that we actually need to look at the languages, and especially at the oral languages, the minority languages, these unstandardized languages that people actually speak day to day, and not at just the sort of top level like national origin, right? Because a lot of the nation states either didn't exist at the time, or the majority peoples of the nation states actually sort of stayed home, and it was actually the ethno-linguistic, religious, and other minorities who ended up coming to New York. And beyond that, you're also talking about the remnants of otherwise marginalized, enslaved, decimated peoples who also came seeking refuge here, right? And this is a continuing story. At the same time, you might say, well, what happens when all the languages arrive? What does that look like? And given that these are primarily oral languages and people arriving into this, English-speaking kind of national picture, they never achieve the visibility even for others to necessarily know that they're here outside of those communities. And language shift becomes a pervasive fact of the city's history, right, with people feeling the pressure to shift not just to English, but often, as I said, to those other large lingua francas. So a speaker of Nahuatl or Mixteco coming from Mexico, shifting fully to Spanish here. Perhaps that shift was already beginning back in Mexico, but then it carries on here. Somebody from Central Asia continuing or completing the shift to Russian, which was already perhaps happening back there, completing that when they're coming to Brooklyn. This happens at different rates in different communities, and there have been many communities which have said, this is fine, we don't care, it's practical, we need to learn the language, the larger language. In other cases, there's been real kind of resistance and an attempt to say, well, we want to preserve our language in various ways, and kind of finding that those strategies. So it happens at different rates, but it's always been happening. And then there's all the contact which is happening between these languages too. So there's this whole kind of field within linguistics of language contact. What happens when speakers of different languages come together? Language mixing, we might know about Spanglish, but there's all kinds of other examples as well. And to what extent do they become new languages? To what extent are they kind of contextual creative practices that are evolving? These are all questions, but languages sort of influencing each other, changing. What does it mean that every form of Spanish from all over the world is spoken in this one place, right? More so than any other place in Spain or Latin America. What does it mean that nearly every form of Arabic from Mauritania to Iraq is also kind of spoken in the city? Does that lead to to what extent are speakers in contact with each other? To what extent are the languages kind of begin to kind of converge? These are all questions. But then the book, and I think what we maybe will focus on, is kind of post 1965. Right, you have these sort of cycles of migration, different groups at different times. We all know about Ellis Island as a kind of famous model of New York as this immigrant gateway, and of course New York often is just that kind of gateway, right? People come here for a few years or for a period of time, and then are off to other places in the U.S. or in the world. And of course some people will go back, and there's all kinds of complex movements, but. Ellis Island shapes a city which at that point became kind of a microcosm of European languages, large and small. But then you have this kind of reaction, 1924, we're in the 100th anniversary now of the U.S. kind of slamming the door shut with a major anti-immigrant act which was passed, and basically for 40 years severely reduced immigration, basically closed down Ellis Island, and fundamentally kind of changed the city and the country in various ways. And then only in 1965 is the door reopened through a new immigration act that passes through Congress and fundamentally transforms the city and the country. And I would say now what's happening with immigration as one of the major political issues of this election and a huge kind of conversation today is a sort of fundamental challenge to the post-1965 picture, which has shaped so much of what's around us. And so what happens now, is hard to say, but basically, this idea that we're in the most linguistically diverse city in the history of the world, that is not something that we can take for granted that's always going to continue, right? This is something that could change and depends on policies and mobilities and, what happens. So since 1965, the city has been transformed. It's become much more like a microcosm of global linguistic diversity. Of course, there are always very particular stories, and it's not that every place is represented here, but we've seen the formation of a Latin American New York, an Asian New York, a Caribbean New York, an African New York, each of which has its own kind of dimensions and microcosms of whole regions of the world in much of their linguistic diversity kind of being mapped onto, especially now, the outer boroughs. It used to be Manhattan in the 19th and early 20th centuries that was the center of this, and at that time also New York, you have to remember, is the biggest and most powerful city in the world. Arguably it still is in many ways, but at that time it also, a lot of this also hinged on and was connected to all this economic growth, the largest port in the world, right? It's all kind of in connection with each other. So this is also, New York was kind of in some ways the earliest place where a lot of this was happening, and now part of the reaction I think we're seeing is, well, what happens when this is elsewhere, right? Today it's not just New York. Today it's it's LA, it's Houston, it's Atlanta, it's even kind of in the suburbs, it's in smaller towns. This sort of deep diversification is something that New York has been living with longest and has transformed us in all kinds of ways and shaped who we are. And is now kind of a bedrock, but in other places it's a relatively newer development, right? So, the picture today, and the question is this going to be peak linguistic diversity, given all these challenges, language loss that's happening all over the world, immigration, politics, and issues. At this point, we've mapped the presence of over 700 distinct languages around the New York area, so that's about 10% of the world's total. And I'll show quickly the sort of the map where we've done that. This was like our own kind of linguistic census at the Endangered Language Alliance, because the regular census really does not capture this stuff for various reasons. There are patterns to it, right? It's also how people are settling, how people are coming, what people are speaking. These things are, have a patterning and a structure to them that I think by mapping and then by recording and talking to people and understanding their linguistic situations here sort of comes out. It's not just random. But to what extent is it all just kind of slipping through our fingers, right? It's a big question as to whether is there any support for most of these languages here? Do we even recognize their presence? Is there any kind of linguistic infrastructure in terms of interpretation and translation and so on? So I guess I'm going to go just really quickly through, so where are some of these languages coming from? What does this mean? As I said, the Mexican migration to New York, which really took off, especially in the 1990s, and since then, is heavily coming from southern Mexico, from a few states. This is showing where indigenous languages are spoken in Mexico, and those are heavily spoken in some of those same southern states. So it's no wonder you will have tens of thousands of speakers of varieties of Mixteco and Nahuatl and Tlapaneco and a dozen other indigenous languages of southern Mexico coming to places in Brooklyn and the Bronx and so on. And some of these also, Mixteco, for instance, this would be the most widely spoken, is actually almost a small family of languages. So that thing I said about standardization, actually about being primarily oral, means that from town to town there are often substantial differences back in the region. So that poses different challenges and questions, but even from a linguistic side, we don't even have a clear sense always of what the trying to enumerate and say how many varieties are there or how does this work and so on. What would it mean to sort of have translation? Certainly in terms of linguistic infrastructure and city policy, and we do some stuff with city government agencies, it means focusing on oral messages and video and audio messages, not just sort of translating posters and so on, but having sort of an oral dimension and having speakers who are local, who are from the particular place, from the particular community, understanding what the real sort of sister cities of New York neighborhoods are, right? Because migration also works through very particular translocal connections between a particular town in Puebla and a particular neighborhood in Brooklyn or something like that, right? It's not just that people are coming sort of evenly spread from a country and they're coming evenly spread here. It's particular connections through families, through communities, and that is reflected in language. And understanding the linguistic situation in each country is crucial. So Guatemala is really characterized by Mayan language diversity, and so you see that very much within the Mayan community here, within the Guatemalan community in New York. So people are coming primarily from the Western Highlands, which is where the Mayan languages continue to be spoken. The Garifuna community, I think, is a really important example too of this complexity, where language is really the thing that gives you an insight. There are probably more Garifuna in New York than there are perhaps in any other place in the world. This is an Afro-Indigenous language that forms initially on the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean, with people who are escaping enslavement and then kind of intermarrying and mixing with local Arawakan-speaking neighbors there. Ultimately expelled by the British to what's now the coast of Honduras, Belize, and sort of in Central America. and then ultimately from there also are being kind of uprooted in various ways and have come to Brooklyn and the Bronx really in the last 60, 70 years, and speak this, a highly distinctive language that reflects that history of like triple diaspora at this point. Now I think we're seeing perhaps now the largest migration, indigenous migration out of Latin America is from the central Andes, especially from Ecuador. It's been happening since the 1990s, but even accelerating in the last couple of years. Speakers of different Quechuan languages, so some will just say Quechua, but in Ecuador it's usually said Quichua. And actually, again, we're talking about a whole kind of group of languages, a family of languages, where there's a lot of differences depending on where exactly you're from. We've done some work. This is just showing, okay, what neighborhoods are people in, what are the major languages, just for different places in Latin America. Another area, one of the other kind of language hotspots that is fueling linguistic diversity in New York is the Himalaya. This is a look at Nepal, which is for a relatively small population, not much more than the greater New York area, has something like 140 different languages represented in it, where Nepali is actually, it's the national language, but it's not the mother tongue of the majority of the population. This arrow is just pointing to one particular valley in the Himalayan area called Mustang, and out of a population of something like 10,000 people in Mustang, where there are something like 6 languages spoken, you have as many as a quarter or a third of those people coming to New York, primarily to Brooklyn and Queens. So this is just an image of the sort of a kind of mapping really close to where we are, right? We're talking about Sunnyside, Woodside, Jackson Heights, of the Himalayan diaspora in its dozens of languages that has come to New York for various reasons, right? So part of it is political, part of it is climate change, part of it is economic incentives, but this is the center of it. So this is Mustang. This is just showing how each of these languages of Mustang is represented here. Mustang itself, is now, its trajectory and fate is really linked to that of Queens and Brooklyn, right? And these communities being here. So what does it mean for such a large, portion of a place to have moved over here? And that means, to some extent, that those villages on that side of the world are depopulated, right? That all the working age people have left those places. It's older people, a few little kids, as well as some people coming from neighboring areas who kind of filling in the gap. There are remittance relationships that kind of connect now New York, people sending money back, all kinds of translocal connections. There is a language which I've spent a long time kind of documenting now with Rasmina Gurung, one of the youngest speakers who lives here in Brooklyn, called Seke, from this place Mustang, with about 700 speakers total, mostly from 5 villages in Mustang. This is just to give an example of one of these languages. And now you have, again, about a third of the speakers having come to New York, and actually even kind of living within a couple of so-called vertical villages, like apartment buildings where they're managing to live with each other and create a new space for the language. So, this is the move you have from this place Tuksang in Mustang to a building in Brooklyn. This is the community here in Brooklyn. This is a picnic on July 4th in Prospect Park, where you have, a seventh of the total number of speakers in the world kind of gathering at a single picnic. Vertical villages obviously are a whole kind of new kind of special space for a language, and raise the question of whether a language can be sort of maintained in them. But we all know that real estate in New York is something that's ever changing and ever challenging, and so how much these can last is a big question. And we're not just talking about people only speaking Seke or only speaking Seke in English. These are, people like Rasmina are among the highly multilingual people that we're talking about here. So Seke is in contact with all these other languages, both from the region, from the nation, from a culturally kind of related region, so Tibetan, and it's producing really interesting sort of new forms of language mixture and language contact, but at the same time this is part of what's putting pressure on Seke for people to shift. So in terms of what does it mean to do work on a language like Seke, and I think in some ways at least it dovetails with and connects to oral history methods, and I've certainly learned from talking to and working with oral historians. We're recording the language, and we're sitting with speakers. we're obviously focused on the language itself and hearing people speaking the language in the ways that they do, right? The different genres of speech, whether it's songs or conversations or traditional storytelling or describing kind of procedurally, how do you do something, how do you weave, how do you do this, how do you do that? And how do you sort of elicit language? How do you bring people out and kind of, obviously in some ways, as soon as you bring out a recorder, it's a bit of an unnatural situation. And in cases of language shift, people are already going to do a lot of mixing, or certainly the presence of an outsider, even though, I'm learning Seke and you're trying to do as much of it as possible in the language. There is a whole set of methodologies that linguists have been developing in the last couple of decades in response to language endangerment to try to build a corpus of recordings, to try to elicit the materials that will kind of go into a language documentation. So a language documentation project is usually, trying to build out a dictionary, which will not exist for these languages generally, a grammar, which will try to describe all the sort of rules and regularities that underlie it, as well as a corpus of texts. So those are, what I said, different genres. Could be jokes, could be proverbs, could be life stories, oral histories, and those should be transcribed and translated as much as possible and analyzed so that people can see the language in action. And then these materials are supposed to be archived, obviously, and have good metadata so that they can be, searched and discovered and in some cases used by members of the community themselves to revive the language, to create materials, textbooks, children's books. All these things at least are supposed to be possible products when you work on documenting a language. One of the big questions for us is how do you sort of work between places when communities are in diaspora and they're in multiple places and the language varies between them. And this fieldwork on Seke, which is just one of the projects that I describe in the book and that we've been doing at the Endangered Language Alliance, is a multi-sited project fundamentally. And when we have had the opportunity to work in Mustang in Nepal, that's obviously where some of the older speakers are. That's kind of a home for the language, right? That's where the natural and cultural and historical setting is, the plants, the animals, the buildings, a lot of the historical sites. But at the same time, if a large number of the speakers are here in Queens, you've got to do stuff on 36th Street, And what does that look like? What are those questions like? And how do you work between the two places? Not just interviewing between the two places, but what's the sort of division of labor of, because a lot of the work is not just recording, but it's that transcribing, translating, analyzing, publishing, and obviously just hanging out and being with people and getting to know a community. This is what it can look like in Mustang. This is with working with Rasmina, and part of it is also about sort of traveling with people from here back there, and vice versa if possible. A language like Seke is completely invisible as far as the census is concerned or as far as any official data is concerned. So another important piece of this, the census has one question about language. It foregrounds a few national languages, like, for example, Korean, Italian, Spanish, Vietnamese. It just, for various reasons, the way that it's asked, who takes the census, the response rate to the census, the way that the census data itself is tabulated, the census just does not capture most of the languages we're talking about. And this is what led us, working with, communities like the Seke speakers, to say, well, we need to try to map languages in New York as they actually are in all of their linguistic diversity. And this started with a Mother Tongues of Queens map a bunch of years ago, which was published in this atlas called Nonstop Metropolis. It's a sort of very cool atlas of all things New York. Obviously, we found there are obviously these kind of largest languages that have, tens of thousands of speakers, but we were already choosing to emphasize and bring out the smaller ones that are not coming out on the census at all. This led us, I'm sorry, this is also small, but we're obviously also packing a lot in here. This was a sort of full city map, and actually including some of the surrounding area too. First done as a kind of traditional print map with an old school cartographer. And then this has led us finally, the last iteration is a digital map, which is totally free to check out. It's there. It's at languagemap.nyc. Check it out when you have a chance. It's interactive. It has a lot of recordings in as much as possible in the languages where we've made recordings. So we've mapped over 700 languages to over 1,200 sites. We have recordings in probably over 100 of those at this point, and generally not the biggest ones, because those you can find recordings on elsewhere. But you can sort of click on different sites and you can see, the story of a language, learn a little more about it. There are various ways to search and filter the data and make comparisons. We also do include the census data as well, so you can kind of compare where it's useful for the largest languages. As I was saying, you kind of, by zooming into this thing, you can really see a lot about the city's linguistic geography and what actually makes up New York on a cellular level. So by understanding that Brighton Beach is not just about people speaking Russian, that may be the lingua franca, and you might hear that, and people might say, oh yeah, that's a Russian neighborhood. Actually, it's a neighborhood of dozens of languages where Russian is a connector, but people are speaking languages from across the Jewish diaspora, they're speaking languages of Central Asia, of the Caucasus, and so on. And likewise, in terms of the West African world in Harlem and the Bronx, over 100 languages of West Africa. Arabic and French both can play some role as lingua francas, connecting people, and certainly, some of the languages are bigger than others, spoken by, thousands, but others are spoken by just a small number, and here they're kind of foregrounded. Likewise, Jackson Heights as a South Asian and Himalayan hub, like we talked about. And as I said, this question of peak diversity, comes from a number of different directions. What are the threats to all of these languages? Some of it also has to do with city life, right? Gentrification, real estate. People are always moving and changing, but what is that? To what extent are languages able to kind of survive and thrive here? And maybe this will be my last kind of before we go into questions. What are we doing about this? Okay, this is all interesting, but this is what's driven the formation of this organization, which I co-direct, the Endangered Language Alliance, and which I tell the story of in the book alongside all this other stuff. We came together in 2010 as a kind of coalition of linguists, language activists, language lovers, ordinary New Yorkers, saying that we have this extraordinary opportunity. We're in the most linguistically diverse city, but it's kind of running through our fingers. We don't, people don't even sort of value that this is here. And there's a lot that can be done just in terms of documenting languages for which there's little documentation and which are endangered. There's also a lot in terms of bringing languages to a wider audience and public attention and revaluing them. Some of the work is documentation and is more technical and academic, like I said, using software and technology in many cases to actually build up databases where we have the recordings that we've been doing. And I think in this sense there's I don't know to what extent oral historians are also doing this, but there's a sort of, we're taking some of the same kinds of materials but also doing more technical types of work with them as well. But that's kind of crucial to being able to create a kind of permanent, transparent record of these languages. Building a digital archive of them as well, where people can access them, but also holding public events, putting languages on stage and sort of in front of new audiences, having classes or hosting classes in languages for languages that are not generally being taught anywhere else. Publishing and literacy. So there is often, this question, okay, well, most of these languages are traditionally oral, but what about now? Don't people want to write them? What does that look like? And it often is the case that part of documenting or maintaining or reviving a language today does involve writing in some form, and there are choices about how you're going to write the language. If you're going to have any publishing, any children's books or textbooks or teaching them, there is often that need. So those are discussions. So we have a Mixteco mothers group that's meeting every week, where they're working to teach themselves to read and write the language so that they can then teach their kids. We've been publishing children's books where possible in a variety of languages. This is a series that we did in the Pamiri languages of Tajikistan, 6 different languages that are spoken by one of the sort of newest communities coming to New York from Central Asia. And this was an event with some Pamiri parents and children that we did with the release of those books. Then there's the whole side of kind of advocacy and language access, working with city government. Like I said, some city agencies are starting to kind of think about this stuff and awaken to it and think about, what does it mean during a public health crisis? What does it mean, when you're trying to roll out programs that are meant to benefit immigrant communities? How do you get out the word about those things? This really kind of came to a head at the height of COVID, right? In like March, April 2020. A lot of the more sort of academic and documentary work we did kind of went on hold, and we sort of just turned our attention to trying to get out messages about COVID and help communities that were at the epicenter of the epicenter, right? As so many were here in Queens, And what we found partly is that the language map, where linguistic diversity was concentrated also mapped onto and was connected to where COVID cases were highest. And there were a number of reasons for that, right? People being essential workers, not being able to escape the city, living in overcrowded conditions where it was harder to kind of do any kind of social distancing or make space. And then also the language side, because people were not getting information in their languages in time about these fast evolving public health challenges. And it's a huge challenge when you're talking about so many languages, and of course things were even more challenging for those in the hospital and getting care and where interpretation was going to come from. You couldn't bring friends or relatives during that time into the hospital, which is often how people do get their interpretation. They can't rely on any sort of public systems. They have their own family member doing that interpretation, but it all added up to a sort of a perfect storm for many multilingual communities. On the other hand, there was a huge response that we tried to support and be part of. People recording PSAs, as I said, mostly audio and video, much more powerful and important for oral languages than just translating, posters. People started recording. We were commissioning people to record COVID diaries, sort of the oral history of what they were going through day to day, just 10 minutes a day in their languages, what they were seeing in their particular community. Again, there was no data about how people were being affected in these communities because it was just sort of the only way it was broken out was through sort of large, large categories, not really kind of doing justice to all the different experiences. So a lot happened. I figured I would just sort of maybe stop there because I know some people have to leave, and I also wanted to have some time for questions. But the full story is in Language City. But thank you for listening, and happy to chat more.
One of my students who actually is Quechua, the reason I brought them here was because she was supposed to come and decided she couldn't come today. But she could go to the Alliance and get some help with the language, because she's having trouble. She wants to preserve it. She's working with a family. She was saying there's no books, there's no this, there's no that.
We can at least point her in the right direction. Yeah, I should say we're a small organization. I don't want to give the sense that we're like a giant operation that can do everything, but we're around. Please put her in touch. Anybody who's interested in language, wants to do things with their language, we try to respond and make connections.
Cool. All right. It was well worth the trip.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Just hoping I have a letter. You went on that phone the whole time.
So now we're down to the oral history contingent. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for bringing
everybody. I didn't get the handout on. I think there was one handout on language.
I think it's by on the table there. I think the black and white one probably.
That's okay. We'll figure it out. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There might be, I think there's some stuff in the chat.